Hey there, welcome to the sermon preview for this week. Glad you're taking a second to join me here today to prepare yourself for the sermon. This week we are again continuing on in our 1 Peter series where we're talking about the idea of living hope. The series title is Living Hope, where Jesus is our only source of hope. This week we're going to be looking at 1 Peter chapter 4, verses 1 through 6. So we're jumping into chapter 4. We've worked our way through verse by verse almost through the first 3 chapters. And so we're going to continue to do that this week, looking at the first section in verse 4. So if you remember from last week, the end of the passage more or less talked about Christ's victory, or how he had victory even though he didn't deserve death. He took that death upon himself for our sake, for our sin. If you remember, the righteous died for the unrighteous, right? We are the unrighteous. So in light of that, Peter moves into this passage, and he starts off by saying, since Christ suffered in the flesh. So he's reminding us again, Christ suffered in the flesh. And then he tells us to arm yourselves with the same way of thinking. Now, without getting too deep into this, what is something or another passage in Scripture that seems to be a parallel to this idea of arm yourselves with this? Think about that. We'll talk about it a little bit on Sunday, but what else is out there? Who else might talk about this idea of arming yourself or putting something on in order to move forward in this same way of thinking? But then there's an interesting verse here at the end of verse 1, actually, that brings up some questions for us. I'm just going to read it here for a second, just so that we can familiarize ourselves with it. For whoever has suffered in the flesh has ceased from sin. Okay. So on my paper, I've got a big question mark behind the ceased from sin part. What does that mean? Are we able in this lifetime to fully cease from sin? At the surface level, it almost appears like maybe that is what this is talking about. And so that's something we're going to talk about on Sunday. Are we able to be completely be ceased, have no more sin in our life? What does the rest of Scripture tell us about this? So I would encourage you to do some research in preparation for Sunday on that. Can we completely cut out sin from our life? Because maybe this passage, maybe that's what that's telling us. But Peter, he leads into this idea of being different from culture, not giving into those things or participating in those things. He has a list of certain things that were prevalent in that culture that they didn't need to be participating in. And so take a look at what are those things, what are those list that Peter gives, and maybe what are modern equivalents of that. Maybe they're the same thing, maybe they're different, and where do we go from there? And then there's another big question mark for me down in verse 6. For this is why the gospel was preached even to those who are dead. We don't, this a little bit of a connection back to verse 19 from last week, where it said that Jesus proclaimed to the spirits in prison. It's one of those weird verses that we just don't know a whole lot about, or we don't know the very specific meaning behind it. Peter, I'm sure, had a specific meaning behind it, and we just don't know the meaning. And so we'll dig a little bit deeper into what that means. What does it mean that he preached to those who were dead? So there's a lot going on in this verse, some big question marks that we have for ourselves of what does this mean? What is Peter talking about here when he says these things? And then there's a clear call to live differently from the people around us. So I would encourage you to read this passage, maybe in a few different translations, ask some questions. What are things that you're confused about? And reflect on this idea. Are you living your life different from society? Is there a list of things that you can make of society is living this way, but I'm going to live this way? I don't want to participate in these things because I want to be different from the culture around me. What are those things? How are you living different from the culture around you? So think about those things. Prepare yourself for Sunday. Really looking forward to Sunday, to being able to have a conversation about this passage. I hope you are as well. We'll see you Sunday, 9:15. Take care.